Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our series, The Salient Characteristics of Master, through Swami's biography of him, chapter 17. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to lift our spirits into your all-pervading love. Show us that any unhappiness or anxiety we feel in this world is not because of the circumstances of our lives, but is always because we have moved too far away from you. All security, all joy, all love in this world comes from our relationship with you. Keep us close. Help us to open our hearts that we may receive all that you so lovingly long to give us. Om. Peace. Amen. This is characteristic number 24, and it says, he laughed readily, but when he chose to be serious, no one could make him even smile. His control in such ways was remarkable. I never saw him succumb to hilarity. It's just a few sentences here for us to work with, but it's really very interesting. So let's just sort of take it piece by piece. It starts with the simple phrase, he laughed readily. You know, Master did not, among the things that Swami talked about with Master was he wore his realization comfortably like a worn old jacket. You know, you sort of picture some corduroy coat that someone has patched the sleeves of, but it's so soft and it's so comfortable. I know I'm very susceptible to my clothes. I'm aware now that I'm a Nayaswami and I have so few choices, but nonetheless, even within my tiny little sphere, I maintain my pickiness, so to speak. And there's certain garments that I have, and I'm sure you have the same ones, that are just so soft and so indestructible that when you want to just be completely at ease and at home, at least I do, I put those particular garments on because they're inherently comforting and at ease within them. So that phrase of Swamiji's, that Master wore his realization like a comfortable old jacket, was always very interesting to me because it conjured up a particular picture in my mind, which is quite different than the picture that we often have, where we think that a person of realization has to walk around being realized all the time. You know, as Swami himself said, when he met Master through Autobiography of a Yogi. So he'd read that book, he felt this divine connection with Master that caused him to take a bus all the way across the country, and to the first words he spoke to Master were, I want to be your disciple, which Swami said which were words he never imagined himself saying to anyone. And he did all of this. He made all these decisions and made that statement to Master, I want to be your disciple, really before he had met Master. Except, of course, they'd met in consciousness and they'd met in past lives. It was, all of that could be said, but still, it was interesting. So then Swamiji said, when he began to hear Master lecture, especially the first time he heard Master lecture, Swami came to Los Angeles. He was accepted as a monk. He moved into Mount Washington, into the monastery there. Well, he met Master in person on a Sunday afternoon after Master had finished giving his service. Because Swami went to Encinitas first and found out that Master was in Hollywood. So Swami had to go up to get a bus and go up to Los Angeles, go to the Hollywood church, but he didn't get there till the service was over. So he meets Master personally, but he doesn't hear Master give a lecture or his public persona. And then I believe it was 2 weeks before Master gave service again. I'm not sure that Swami saw Master much during, or at all during that time. I'm not sure. I think he didn't, but I'm not sure. But in the 2 intervening weeks, the Sunday service was given by one of the other monks, Reverend Bernard, who was a very accomplished and dedicated disciple and an intellectual man. And so Swami heard Reverend Bernard give 2 of the SRF services, which was the first time Swami had ever heard any of it given. And he said Bernard fulfilled Swami's expectations about what a spiritual teacher should be like. He had a deep voice. He spoke somewhat like, with the impression that everything he was about to say was important. I mean, Bernard was very helpful and very clear in the way he taught, and actually was Swami's conduit for understanding a great deal of the teachings, because Bernard was highly qualified. He just had a manner that was more like that. So when Swami finally heard Master speak, he said he was quite a bit surprised by it, because Master was so casual, so lighthearted, and so, not speaking from Mount Olympus down to the people, but just being at ease right with the audience and teasing and making jokes and just being so spontaneous and natural. He wore his realization like a comfortable old jacket. There was no necessity whatsoever for Master to hold himself back from the ordinary ways of being that is what it is to be a human being. And interestingly, Swami talked about this in other contexts, like there were other great saints like Ramana Maharshi and others who nonetheless just sort of kept a little bit of a distance between themselves and everyone else. And now Swamiji never kept that distance. Swamiji in every way, every one of these characteristics that I speak about Master, from my experience, I take Swami's definition of Master from his experience of Master, and I believe it. I accept it. But part of the reason that it makes perfect sense to me is that I saw these exact characteristics exemplified in Swamiji. And that I saw up close for decades. So it wasn't a question of taking someone else's word for it. It was my own observation and my own, as best I'm able to exercise it, intuitive discrimination. And it was very interesting. At the end of Swamiji's life, Narayani writes about this in her book about Swamiji, My Heart Remembers Swami Kriyananda. I believe I mentioned it in Light Bearer also, that this other Swami, this Indian Swami, who was very, very highly regarded, who was a hermit in the jungle, basically, who had disciples and he would come out sometimes. But he came to visit Swami Kriyananda. He specifically broke his own seclusion in order to have the darshan of Swamiji. And he said to Narayani and Shurjo, "You have no idea what you have in him." And he specifically pointed out the fact that Swami felt that there was no necessity for Swami to protect himself from the downpulling influence of humanity. Swami just moved and lived in this world as comfortably, just as comfortably as he could, without any any of the accoutrements that are designed also to protect the spiritual person from too much of the downward pulling contact. And this Swami told us, he says, it's because Swamiji wears his realization like a comfortable old jacket. He didn't use those words, but that's what he was saying. He's so secure in his own realization that he doesn't have to protect his own consciousness. Now, I have no way to evaluate anything like that. I can only observe what he said was true. my experience of Swamiji. And this is just what he says here. Now, this is where the phrase was, Master Rat laughed readily, because he was just there. He was living the same life we were, and was easily able to enter into the ebb and flow of human life. And as I've talked about in other sections when we were talking about humor, Swami himself pointed out that humor itself, the ability to laugh, is a very interesting characteristic, because the ability to laugh tends to come when there's an ordinary flow of life going on, and then something happens, and it just moves you out of the ordinary flow. And when that ordinary flow is broken in an upward moving way, often it expresses itself as laughter, because just something has just changed. And it usually changes in a split second. It might be because we've reached the punchline of the joke, or it might be just because something that happened just is so ludicrous in itself that we just can't help but being amused by it. And Swamiji had said that, clean, kindly entertainment. That's how Swami put it. Clean, kindly humor, not cruel humor. But clean, kindly humor is very spiritual, because in order to appreciate it, we have to have the flexibility of mind to let go of one perspective on reality and suddenly see another one. And if we're too rigid, and this is Swami pointed out in various other places, that very dogmatic people, even very dogmatic religious people, and certainly fanatics of any kind, usually do not have the capacity to enjoy spontaneous, kindly humor, because their mindset is too rigid, and they can't just easily flip over into the absurd, because often what makes something funny is the sheer absurdity of it. It's just like you're going along expecting one thing, and then it turns into something else, and just even the thought of it, you see, it makes you laugh, just because it's so unexpected, whatever it was that happened. So the fact that Master could laugh readily meant that he was very much at ease, that he had an exceedingly flexible perspective on reality, that he didn't have any trouble just entering into the ebb and flow, as I was saying, the absurdity of human life, and that he himself didn't have to protect himself. The other thing that happens when you laugh, and this is just something I've thought about, laughter puts you in the now. I mean, when you're actually laughing, spontaneous laughter, spontaneous, kind laughter, it puts you in the now. You lose connection with the past and the future for that moment. The Master Swamiji said that Master often told jokes in the course of his sermons, or would say things that were humorous, and would have people just, laughing wholeheartedly. And then right after that, Master would often slip in some very serious spiritual teaching, because the relaxation, and then I've added to that, the bringing people completely into the now makes a certain receptivity. One of the things that extraordinarily blocks our capacity to experience the divine is because we spend so much time in the past and in the future. The experience of the restrictions placed upon my life by COVID, none of which are onerous. In fact, I actually realize how much I've enjoyed the restrictions that have been placed upon me. It's just kept me slightly separated from ordinary life, and I really actually have thrived on that. My cloistered samskars are enjoying this tiny bit of narrowing of my life options. I fall into it very naturally because I have good friends and I have a tremendous opportunity to serve. I need to say that. I couldn't live reclusive. I don't think I could do that at this stage of my life without a project. I could probably go right for a long time, but I would still have to serve. I would have to have the project. But now let me think where I was going with that, the reclusive. Let's see. Well, whatever the point was, am I bringing that up? Oh, yes. What that's done, and I've mentioned this before, is that it's made the what you would call the picture of my consciousness a lot less cluttered. And therefore, the actual cause and effect between my state of consciousness and any external event, the folly of the belief that my state of consciousness is actually caused by external events, has been more vividly displayed to me. In theory, I've always known it, and I've been able to act on that theory to a certain extent, but the lack of the simplicity of the external world as I've been living it has made it much more clear to me that my consciousness, my state of consciousness merely ebbs and flows. And anything that I think of as causing that is really not true. It's just that my state of consciousness ebbs and flows. And what's so interesting about it is the degree to which it ebbs and flows depending on whether I'm living in the past or the future. Now, I know these are cliches on the spiritual path. You know, Baba Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, back in the 60s and the 70s, was just seminal in terms of creating an entire generational revolution. Personally, it wasn't one of my books. In fact, I've never actually read it. But the title, Be Here Now, just like, and how often are we here now? But one of the times that we are is when we laugh, because everything else is forgotten in that uplifted moment. And Master laughed readily. He was always ready to just see it from another angle and be amused. Somewhere Master says all of life is designed just for our education and entertainment, which is a phrase I've really come to use a lot. I'll say, oh, that was educational, or that was entertaining. You know, most of us are neither educated nor entertained by life. We suffer instead. But for our education and our entertainment is something that's really worth thinking about. And of course, entertainment generally involves at least a moment or two of laughter. And so Master laughed readily, because that's what we're here to do. But then he says, but when he chose to be serious, no one could make him even smile. His control was remarkable. And that his control, you might also say, was his concentration. When Master was focused on a certain reality, nothing could deflect him from it. And much to my chagrin, I found that so with Swami, because my concentration isn't remarkable. Although I can, and I do concentrate a lot, and I concentrate quite well, but I have what I lovingly call a Gemini mind, which is always interested in everything and has many, many different initiatives running at the same time. And oftentimes with Swamiji, when I would work for him, I would want him to pay attention to what I wanted him to pay attention to in the timeline that I wanted. And I got better, but I was sometimes remarkably insensitive to the fact that he was thinking about something else or concentrating on something else, and this was not the moment. And I experienced exactly what Swami said. If he was focused in one way, he was not going to be deflected, period. So sometimes the laughter was not appropriate. And I know I've seen, and I myself have done, Swamiji might be trying to convey something that's very serious, that has to be considered. And people get uncomfortable sometimes when Swami would be trying to get across something serious and would try to deflect it with laughter. On a couple of notable occasions, much to my regret, Swami brought up something that was serious, that he wanted me to take seriously, and I deflected it with a joke. And then he saw that I wasn't going to listen, so he withdrew the effort. But when Master, Swami sang, and when Swami was determined in a direction, he would not be deterred. Just period. And it wasn't unkind. You know, he didn't need to react against what you were doing. There was no need for him to step into it, unless there was. I mean, on occasion he, like one time when I was arguing with him about something, when I was trying to persuade him to a different point of view. Argue is not the right word because Swami wouldn't argue. Then I wasn't really arguing. I just wanted him to come to a different conclusion than the one he'd come to. So I was trying to give him all the reasons why I thought another conclusion was better, because I was very sincere with Swami. I learned to be sincere with him. But in this case, Swami lost his patience one of the few times he ever did. And he said, Asha, you always agree with me in the end, so why don't you just be quiet and think about it? But that was one of the rare times that he actually came out against, and against what I was saying. Most of the time, he accomplished the same goal simply by ignoring it. He didn't have to speak against it. He just essentially refused to relate to it. And that's what he describes with Master. No one could even make him smile. He refused to relate to a vibration of consciousness which in the moment for Master was not suitable. Because he was, any of the scenarios that I described, he was trying to accomplish something else. Somebody's energy was insensitive. They themselves were trying to deflect an energy that they didn't want to have to face. It could be any one of those things. He didn't have to put you down. He would just refuse to relate to it. Just continue as if you hadn't done it. Now, this was not an instance of laughter, but this was one of these things. And to this day, I cannot understand why I was so insistent on this particular thing that I did, but it was one of those. Swami was following a particular protocol, a health protocol that had been recommended to him. He was following a whole regime that this local healer was giving him. Swami, when he would commit himself to someone's protocol, he would be very faithful to it. He wouldn't try to second guess it or amend it. He would do just what they wanted. And one of the things that this healer wanted was that she did not want him to mix fruit and vegetables. It was like either you have a vegetable meal or a fruit meal, but you don't have them together. This is a theory of diet with which I'm quite familiar. I myself followed that. I still follow it to a large extent, but not as faithfully as I did at different times. I was very familiar with it, but I was convinced that apples were an exception. So I was making him juice. He wanted pure carrot juice. I wanted to make him apple carrot juice. He told me that it was against his protocol. I told him that it was fine. And it kind of was left there. I made him apple carrot juice. I put it on the little side table next to him. He never looked at it. He never touched it. He never drank a sip of it. Nor did he ever say anything. He just had it arrive, and then he just refused to relate to it. I was just like, now, the obvious question is, for God's sakes, why didn't I just make him carrot juice? I have no idea. I have no excuse. But that's what happened. But it was very interesting. And there was nothing directed at me. It wasn't like I felt put down or insulted or nothing. He just wasn't going to drink it. He'd made it clear to me that he didn't want it, and I'd insisted, okay, it's just an impasse. So he would have no juice at that time, which he was supposed to have on the protocol, but he wasn't going to have it. That was that. So when Master's control was remarkable, that's what Swami also meant. Master just followed his own course. I mean, this is a profoundly important spiritual principle. Swami has that song which is called either Walk Like a Man or Go On Alone. Even what if others don't share the vision that you hold? Just keep walking. Go on alone. Just do what you know is right. And when he says Master's control was remarkable, you think, well, it's not that hard not to laugh. But what he really meant was Master would not be deflected. And goodness knows, I've met that in Swami. If he feels that he's, this is where he's supposed to be going, what he's supposed to be doing, the vibration, the consciousness, the thought, the project he's in the moment, His control was remarkable. Nothing could turn him away from it. But it was kindly, even in that respect, because it was only concerned with where his energy was going. And let come who will, as the song says, even if they all stay home. And that would be how Master would have done it. Then he says, I never saw him succumb to hilarity. That's another interesting way to think about it, and that's also talking about his control. Master never allowed anything to rule him. He never started laughing so much that he couldn't just stop in an instant. That's what Swami means by succumbing to hilarity, where the laughter is simply beyond your control. It's only happened to me a few times, but it has happened where you're just laughing so hard you can't stop laughing. I don't know if your life depended on it, if you couldn't stop laughing. But what Swami is saying again is Master never lost contact with his calm inner center. And even when he was laughing, the laughter came from that calm inner center rather than from any other level. Now I'm going to end with just an anecdote, just because it was so interesting. It's completely unrelated to Master, but it's about laughter. One of the Christmas meditations at Ananda, this was in the 70s, it was like, the 5th or 6th hour of the 8-hour meditation, completely silent in the temple. I had an almost uncontrollable desire to laugh. It was so strong in me. And my mind was telling me that if in this total silent room where there's, 100 and something people with Swami, we've been meditating all day and we're very deep. And I had this feeling that if I just burst into merry laughter, just breaking the silence, that everybody in the room would just burst into merry laughter with me, and that we'd all be so happy, and it would be such a glorious moment in the meditation. And then simultaneously, as my mind is trying to tell me that, another piece of me remembers that this would not really have the effect that I think it would have on it, that it would be considered extremely odd, very rude, and it was very unlikely that everyone else was going to just join in with me. And for quite some time, at least what felt to me like quite some time, I just had to sort of fight this inner battle, this almost uncontrolled desire to laugh, the rationale for it, and this tiny fragment of reason that kept telling me that this was really not a sane thing to do. And then after a period of time, I sort of gained mastery over the energy, and then we were fine after that. But later, just because it had been so odd, I mentioned to Swami, and I mentioned it mostly in the context of my mental confusion. It's very interesting. Swamiji said, and I'm going to start laughing now because it's the first time I've thought about it. He said, sometimes that's a Kundalini manifestation, is laughter. I'm laughing because I think that's the only actual Kundalini manifestation I've ever had. And I didn't even get to express it because it was the wrong moment. But isn't that interesting? I'm just saying that to you because it's one of those like little vignettes from decades ago that just kind of floats out there without any connecting link to anything. That such a thing as divine energy could really, you could see it. It would make perfect sense because it's a complete release into the now. But never before and never since has that ever happened to me. Well, it's very interesting how Swamiji takes something like Master laughed very easily, but then even that becomes a divine lesson in what it means to be a perfect human being. We're so lucky to have, in so close in time, these wonderful living examples of the presence of God manifested. God bless you.